Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. I wanted to do something a little bit different in this episode, sharing with you some of the principles from my book, Prime Time: The Power of Effective Planning. Because I think as we head into the third month of the first quarter, so to speak, by this point, a lot of people have given up on their goals. I did a podcast a few weeks talking about that and how we shouldn't give up on our goals for this year, but many people have. And I guarantee you that a lot of them, if you were to ask, why did you renegotiate this goal for yourself? A lot of them would tell you they're just too busy. And honestly, a little bit of leadership truth here is that the thing is that we all are given the same number of hours in a day, right? We all have 24-hour days. But the truth comes in sharing with you that if you don't plan your priorities and protect your priorities, then you don't really have priorities. And it's all too easy, if we're not intentional with stewarding our time, it's all too easy for us to get caught up in the whirlwind of life, right? The crazy busy life where you're stretched and you're maxed out and you don't have time for the important things in your life, like exercising or taking care of yourself. And it is easy to do. We've certainly all got a lot of responsibilities and no one wants to drop those responsibilities. But the key, I think, is realizing, number one, where our time is going, and then being intentional with what I call effective planning. So I wanted to do a quick breakdown. Of course, if you find this interesting, you can always pick up a copy of the book on Amazon. It's actually more of a workbook. Like, I actually walk you through in the book worksheets where you drill down into some of these exercises that help you understand the concepts at a deeper level and then apply them to your life and your situation. So where the term prime time came from is prime is an acronym, and each letter, of course, stands for a category of how we can spend our time. So I like to think of this as the blocks of a pyramid. If you had a nice stack of solid pyramid blocks, the block on the bottom is the biggest one, the next block is a little bit smaller, and the third one is a little bit smaller yet again, and all the way so forth until you get to the top block being the smallest. This would be a very stable pyramid. And I label each one of these blocks using the acronym PRIME. Starting at the bottom is the power block. And this is where time and activities in this block we are living in our purpose. We are very productive. We are, really in that purpose-driven life where we're producing, we are purposeful. It's an incredibly effective use of our time. We're doing what we're meant to do. And the second block, obviously, is R. If we're going from the bottom to the top, the second block is the restorative block, or the renewal block, or the recreation block would be, another way to categorize activities in this block. And here's the thing, these first two blocks, obviously, we need renewal, restorative, recreation time if we're going to function our best in our P block, our purpose block, our power block. Right? You can't be your best, most effective, most productive version of yourself if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not getting some downtime, some recreation time. And so those two blocks are the most important use of our time, the most critical, and that's why they're foundational. But here's the thing, ideally, 80% of our time would be spent and allocated in those two blocks. Right? If we could have the perfect world, well, maybe perfect would be even more than 80%. But if we could have an ideal state, knowing that nothing's perfect, we would be spending 80% of our time either producing or renewing and restoring so that we can go back to producing, to being purpose-driven. Now, the next block is the I block, and I call this the incongruous block, which is a big fancy word, but it means almost not just wasteful, but it means not necessarily in alignment with your priorities, meaning time and energy spent in this block is incongruent or not in alignment with your priorities. They might be good things. They just might not be the best use of your time. They might be other people's priorities. And I think that's a good way to look at that. These things that pop up that are not necessarily something you're planning for, but they are important to other people, or they're other people's agendas. Things like, when somebody calls and it's not really a phone call that's productive for you, junk calls, spam emails, maybe trying to sell you something. It might be important to that other person trying to sell you something, but that's not really important to you based on what you want to buy. And so that's not in alignment with a best use of your time reading that email or taking that call. The next block is the M block, and this is what I call the marginal block. And things that time spent in this block are things that are almost manic, right? This is our emergencies that pop up because we didn't plan effectively earlier. Examples of this could be having a major health crisis pop up because you didn't exercise and take care of your health or eat healthy. A heart attack, for example. A lot of times when we look at people who have had heart attacks, perhaps not all of the time, but many times those risk factors for heart attacks can be minimized by just healthier eating and getting some exercise. But if you're not intentional about that, right, those would be intentional exercise and eating healthy would be things that would go in your R block. But if you don't take care of that R block, then you're going to have crisis and emergencies pop up in the M block, things that are now problems because you did not prepare and plan accordingly. And then the E stands for excessive or expendable. Activities in this block, time spent in this block, are just simple time wasters. Things like scrolling social media endlessly for hours and hours, and suddenly you look up and you realize that an hour of your day has gone by and you just meant to pick up your phone and answer one email, right? That doesn't, all social media doesn't have to be a bad thing necessarily, but if it's just sucking time away and energy away from something that you're working on, and suddenly you realize you've wasted an hour and gotten nothing in return for your time and energy, then that's an example of an activity that didn't serve you. And I think that's important to keep this in perspective, is that activities in and of themselves may not be bad. They may have a place, like watching TV, for example. Maybe you want some downtime on the weekend and you want to watch a movie. Sometimes Mac and I love to watch movie on the weekend. And that's just one of the things that we enjoy doing together. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if we were to spend all day, every day, watching movies all the time and not getting our important priorities done or our work done, then that would be an example of an activity that had an appropriate place in our R block, restorative or renewal. But if we do too much of it, then it becomes an activity in the E block, just a time waster, taking away time and energy from other things that we should be doing based on our goals, our priorities. So that's just a very, very, very quick overview of the different ways that I like to categorize time. But you can imagine that pyramid, P at the bottom and the acronym going all the way up to the E block being at the top. And ideally, we'd be spending the bulk of our time on those two foundational blocks, and then respectively, less and less time in each block as we go up the pyramid. And it's a very stable pyramid. But here's the thing, if you were to imagine that pyramid with the E block on the bottom, for example, and then maybe your M block, or then maybe your P block, but it would be a very wobbly, unstable pyramid, right? Because your pyramid would be built on or based on just that little itty bitty E block, and it would be subject to topple over. So I think that always helps me just to get an understanding of the ways that I should be classifying my activity. And, one thing about it is, once you think about this, you don't have to necessarily go through every single activity for the rest of your life and say, well, does this belong in this block or this block? But it's a useful exercise to sit down and look at your calendar for last week, or your journal, or your scheduler, or your online calendar, and just give yourself a few minutes to think about what activities did I do last week that fell into the just complete time waster block. This is an eye-opening exercise. It really is powerful. If you're one of those people who feel like you are incredibly overwhelmed and busy with too much to do, then the first place you got to start is identifying where your time and energy is going so that you can fix it. Incredibly eye-opening. So just get out your calendar and look back over the last week or the last couple of weeks. How much of your time did you spend in that P block? Are you spending enough time in the R block? Now, here's the thing. For a lot of people, that answer is going to be no. And then they immediately have the question of, well, how do I get more time in those blocks? If I'm not spending enough time in those blocks, where can I get more time to spend in those blocks? Well, we've got to minimize the time that we're spending in the other 3 blocks. And you can't do this overnight. You can to some small extent, but you can't really make a huge drastic change overnight, because if you are finding too much of your time is going to the I and the M blocks, then that's time that you can minimize or shrink down and start to use that time more effectively in your P and R blocks. But you can't just wave your magic wand and say all my health problems are going to go away because I didn't take care of my health. Right? You've got to deal with them right now, but you have huge opportunities to redirect your time from that E block, that excessive block, that expendable block, that time waster block, and the I block, right? The incongruent block, the things and activities and time that you're spending on priorities that are not in alignment with your best self. And those are your 2 biggest opportunities. If you start to do that effectively, and plan for that and arrange that, then over time, your M block energy will get smaller, right? But it has to happen through the effective planning. And that's why I call it effective planning. Now, I dig into this a lot more in the book, but I wanted to give you that just brief overview because I think that, obviously the 2 biggest opportunities, getting minimized time and energy on those 2 blocks, the E block and the I block, but it's hard to do. But when you do, you realize the power of being intentional and living with more purpose, and you will find that you are more effective. And that really becomes the secret to being purpose driven is being more productive based on your priorities. And your priorities aren't my priorities. No one can tell you what your priorities are, but you have to figure that out. Then you have to figure out what's not serving you well and living out those priorities. And then you have to figure out what you can do to get more in alignment. And that's not about perfection. It's just about being more purposeful. I did a podcast last year, or maybe the year before that. I need to revisit that because that would be a good podcast to revisit, or that a good subject to revisit again on a future podcast, on my morning routine with my motivational planning journals. It's a very simple exercise. And I even shared the exercise on the podcast. You don't have to buy a journal to get the routine, but if you do, it's got 60 days worth of just a little guide, very simple and effective to guide you through the first few minutes of your day and being intentional with that. And the beauty of that is it helps me be more effective for the rest of my day. Setting aside just a few minutes, the first part of my day, to set my priorities for each dimension of my life. How am I going to get some physical improvement, physical health improvement? What am I going to do today to be a little bit healthier? What am I going to do today to grow my mental development? What am I going to do today to focus on adding value to other people? And so just a very simple routine that I've found that helps me be more intentional and more effective. And then I think the other biggest opportunity, and one that I have struggled with, I'm doing much better about it now, but a lot of times we find ourselves committing to time and activity and things and tasks based on other people's priorities that aren't in alignment with our goals. And it's hard to say no. I realize that. But it's important to realize that time and energy spent on priorities that aren't in alignment, or time and energy spent on activities that aren't in alignment with your priorities, is time and energy you're not spending on your priorities. I've shared the example, I think, before, of someone who contacted me from Mac, and I used to live in a different state many years ago. And someone contacted me and said, you know what, we're doing a food drive. And it was a social group that I had been a member of in years past. And food drives are great. There's nothing wrong with a food drive, but I do not need to spend my time and energy on a food drive. There are people who really are gifted in that, and that's a beautiful thing, but it's not the best use of my time. And so I just had to gracefully decline. Now, there is a time when I would have said yes to everything, because I don't like to tell people no, but I've realized that I can't make the best use of my time if I'm spending it all the time on everything, right? If you can't do everything with excellence, you can do some things with excellence. But if you're spinning your wheels all the time on other people's priorities, you don't have the time and attention to spend on your own. There again, I go into this much more deeper in the book, and I talk about some worksheets, but I wanted to give you some nuggets that you could take away. And again, do that exercise. I encourage you to look back and just circle examples from your calendar where, oh, I was really productive here. This is where I needed to spend my time. This is where I should have said no to this opportunity. This is what I should have minimized. Maybe I should have spent a little bit less time binge watching Netflix, right? Realizing that is the greatest opportunity for improving it. And doing that over time will help you be more effective, more productive, and more successful. Until next time.